Hey there, my name is Porsha Lauri. Welcome to or welcome back to my channel. And today I want to talk to you about a little network you might know, MTV. I'm not here to talk about MTV and their lack of music programming or the fact that the only show they seem to ever play is Ridiculousness and its various spin-offs. Today I'd like to talk to you about a seldom talked about category of MTV shows, MTV's scripted TV shows. As always, if you enjoy my opinion on all things pop culture, music, movies, TV shows, what have you, do me a solid and drop a like on this video, then run over to that subscribe button and hit the bell next to it so you can be notified every time I upload. I don't have any special channel updates or any announcements to make, so let's go ahead and talk about these shows. But there is a subset of MTV programming that I don't really see present currently on the channel, and it's something that I really miss. MTV had quite a few scripted television shows on their platform, some that ran for quite some time and some that disappeared before audiences really had a chance to connect with the characters. So today I wanted to talk about a few of the ones that really stuck out in my mind, and maybe we could spend a little bit of time talking about why these shows are no longer around.
Editing Porsha here to clarify that this video is covering shows that were canceled relatively quickly after they began airing, and not including any of their long-running scripted shows. That will be a whole separate video another time.
So the first show I wanted to talk about was a show called Finding Carter. Finding Carter was an MTV show that aired from 2014 to 2015. In the first episode, Carter is arrested for trespassing, and when she's brought into the police station and her fingerprints are taken, Carter actually finds out that her mother is not her biological mom, and she was actually kidnapped. The show goes on to follow Carter's new life, adjusting to living with her biological family that she's never known even existed, trying to maintain a relationship with her mom/kidnapper, and the typical trials and tribulations of being a teenager. So I'm starting off with this show for a couple of reasons. One, because it was one of the shows that I was really into, would be home every week to watch it. The premise of the show was just so interesting, I had to check it out, and I loved every minute I got to watch this show. So something I thought that was crazy interesting that I found out when I started doing research for this video was a writer named Emily Silver, and she penned the script for the pilot for Finding Carter. And she was shopping around to several networks, but wasn't really getting any biters. Then when MTV picked up this script, they really enjoyed it, but they thought that the author should work with an executive producer to kind of fine-tune the script and make it into something that MTV would then want to make. And would you know who that executive producer is? Terry Minsky. You might recognize that name because she is also the writer of a little show named Lizzie McGuire. And if you know me in real life, you know that I've had a serious obsession with Hilary Duff and Lizzie McGuire alike. So the fact that I ran into this and the fact that she was part of a writer on this show that I was very, very obsessed with, it just made all of the pieces come together. Another aspect of the show that I really personally enjoyed was the fact that the cast was mostly created of unknowns. This is a pattern that you'll see in most MTV shows. I feel like kind of the way Disney is a springboard for many kids' stars' careers, I feel like MTV during this era of having a lot of scripted shows on their platform, they were also a launching pad for many young adults to start off their career. I really enjoyed this cast. I thought they were really talented. I especially was a big fan of Catherine Prescott, the main character, Carter Stevens. I thought that her portrayal of this really unique situation was incredibly good for someone who didn't have a whole lot of roles underneath her belt already. And for me, she really sold this character and this storyline. So Finding Carter actually did find quite a bit of success within its first season, but we slowly started to see a decline by the time season 2 arrived, and the show was eventually just canceled, which left viewers in quite a lurch because season 2 actually ended on a cliffhanger. I also want to take this moment to add that my boy Jasper from Twilight was actually became a main character in the second season of Finding Carter, and I was very interested to see how his role was going to play out on the show. Unfortunately, the show was canceled far before it really had its chance to shine, in my opinion. But I really loved watching this show. I loved it because it felt very raw, and it was unlike most of the programming that was available on MTV. I would also say that during this era, there were a lot of teen drama shows. I think the biggest show during this time frame from 2014 to 2015 would probably be Pretty Little Liars. I think this was MTV's foray into trying to build a TV show that was a destination spot for people, the same way people viewed Pretty Little Liars. They went to, I think it was called ABC Family at the time. They went to that platform to watch that show, and then, you know, you slowly find yourself watching other things. And I think that's what Finding Carter was supposed to be, and unfortunately, that just never came to fruition. I don't know what MTV could have done to make this show last longer or have it be just a bigger part of pop culture. I think that if they had included more big name cameos, that was something that really helped with a lot of new shows. That way they're more incentivized to want to watch the episodes. And I think they tried to do that by bringing in Jasper in the second season. I don't think his name carried quite enough of hype to get fans or Twilight fans to really tune into this little MTV show. But that's my 2 cents on Finding Carter. Let's talk about the next show. So the next show I have to talk about is quite controversial, I think. And seeing as how there was so much controversy that came with this show, I thought it would be an instant success. But unfortunately, this show didn't even last as long as the one we just finished talking about. Let's talk about a little show called Sweet Vicious. For those of you who don't remember the show, let me give you a little bit of backstory. Sweet Vicious was the story of Jules and Ophelia, a kick-ass female vigilante duo hell-bent on bringing justice and revenge to their college campus on anyone that is a sexual harasser. But will they be able to juggle their academic life with their underground life as college superheroes? So that was kind of like a light way to put it, but I thought that so I have so much to say about this show. This show was so good. And the fact that it was canceled is actually criminal. Oh, I forgot to mention, this show aired from 2016 to 2017. So this show came right out of the Brock Turner Me Too movement time frame. We were right in the middle of having all of these big public Hollywood figures being exposed, and that's really what this show was backboned off of. Now, if you're wondering what really made it controversial, I think there's quite a few reasons that made this show a little bit hard to promote to certain audiences. One of the leads is essayed at a frat party. I believe she tries to report what has happened to her. She receives nothing but backlash, and basically her abuser was given a slap on the wrist and just walked away from the situation. She decides to enact revenge. And this kind of bleeds into them becoming a superhero duo. I think the controversy, a lot of it might stem from the fact that these were women taking back their power in a physical, violent way. And although we see this time and time again in superhero movies and action movies in general, and specifically by men, I think the idea of women being equally capable of violence was a hard sell for most networks, which makes sense as to why this show ended up on MTV in the first place. I actually think this is an excellent platform for a show like this, especially in the time that it came out. But I can also see how that could create a lot of frustration from a parental point of view, how they could see this and think that their kids are going to enacting revenge, getting your own justice outside of like a courtroom. I could see how this could be manipulated, and it could make it a very hard sell for parents to allow their children to watch something like this. So unfortunately, the show was ultimately canceled before it could even get to a second season, which took me by quite a surprise. I thought that this show had created quite a bit of buzz. It had trended on Twitter, I think the first night that it premiered, and it was heavily talked about and debated online. However, MTV opted not to pick up the show, and they have time and time claimed that it only had to do with ratings. In my opinion, I think that they canceled the show because they were afraid of the backlash that they would most likely be getting for what the show was presenting. Even though I think that we see tons of shows like this, revenge plots, and once there's an era of violence done by women, it seems as though we have a bigger problem accepting that as a fantasy. And I don't really know. I don't know exactly why that is. That's a little more philosophical that I'm planning to get in this video. After MTV announced the cancellation of Sweet Vicious, there was quite a big petition online going around to try to get the show picked up by another platform. I think Hulu was specifically in talks to possibly pick up Sweet Vicious, but ultimately this never came to fruition for the show. Now, it was announced shortly thereafter the show had been canceled that Black Mask Studios, a comic book studio, was interested in picking up the rights to Sweet Vicious and continuing the series as a graphic novel, which I would love to check out. But here's the thing, it's still not out. They were guesstimating that the comic book would premiere in 2021, but then, you know, everything that happened in 2020. There's a lot of things that have been happening in the world since the show was canceled. So will we ever see where Jules and Ophelia are today? Honestly, I don't think so, but it still lives in a little piece of my heart, this show. If you were a Sweet Vicious fan and you would like to see this show picked back up, even though it's been, what, 5 years since the premiere of it? 7? Let's start a petition. I would really still, like, the more I talk about this show, the more I'm like, yeah, this show was absolutely fantastic. I really wanted to expand on it. They never really got a chance to fully flesh out these characters that just were so layered and so relatable to so many different kinds of people, not just women. I would really personally love to see where Jules and Ophelia's adventures would have led them to. Let's talk about Sweet Vicious more in the comments. Of all the shows I'm going to cover today, this is probably the one that I am most sad is no longer around. So now we're going to take it back quite a few years to revisit a show that I misunderstood as a scripted TV show, only to find out during the making of this video that this show is actually considered reality. But I went ahead and left it on the list because I just wanted an excuse to talk about it. And that show would be My Life as Liz. My Life as Liz featured Liz Lee, a high school senior in a conservative town in Texas trying to make her way with her nerdy friends and love interest Bryson. Her goal is to move to the Big Apple and avoid the mean girls at school at all costs. This show ran from 2010 to 2011. There was a show called The Paper on MTV, and it covered the newspaper staff of a high school. And when that show was coming to an end, because it was following all these senior students who were then graduating high school, they wanted to find a new show to kind of replace that with another show about a journalism student. During their search, they came across a student named Liz Lee. And she was so captivating to the producers that they decided to kind of create an entire show around her and her life. Since My Life as Liz came out in 2010, that tells me that this show was also heavily influenced by another little show you might remember as Laguna Beach. The thing about Laguna Beach is that it was a more upscale idea of a reality show. They used cameras the same way they would in a regular television show setting. They featured voiceovers of the characters going through their daily lives, and they didn't use the typical confessional style that so many other reality shows utilized for their one-on-ones, such as The Real World, America's Next Top Model. You get the drift. And My Life as Liz definitely was modeled similarly to that. I think you can tell in the types of cameras that they're using. It's very highly produced. So it was my understanding that this was a scripted show, and I didn't realize that these were real kids, these were real issues that they were battling, and this was a reality show for the 2 years that it aired. But I enjoyed watching this show because it felt so different than the rest of the programming that was offered for teenagers at the time. Again, I was in my early 20s when I was watching this show, but I definitely still had the mindset very much of a teenager, and so I was still watching many of those shows that centered around high school, even though I definitely had graduated by then. Shows like Gossip Girl, Pretty Little Liars, and The Vampire Diaries were hugely popular at the time. And for me, this show, My Life as Liz, was just very different from those kind of shows. Those shows were just featured beautiful people being beautiful, having beautiful problems that didn't seem real or relatable to me. Whereas Liz Lee just seemed very very normal, very average. She was, you know, kind of a punk rock girl in like the era of the end of emo and the beginning of scene. She wasn't into the Ed Hardys and the rhinestone belts. She was way more into Star Wars and nerd culture. Liz was a nerd before being a nerd was considered cool. This was definitely still an era where we looked at people who were skinny, blonde, and rich as goals, and anyone who didn't fit that mold just need not apply. And I think that that is the basis of why I found this show to be so interesting. I did feel as though the second season was quite boring. The second season actually showed Liz following her graduating from high school in season 1. She did in fact move to the Big Apple. I think she ends up going to school at NYU and trying to pursue her dreams, which I don't remember what they were. I know that they were looking for a journalism student, and I think she was a journalism student, but I don't know that that was really the main focus of the show. Mostly the focus of the show was the kind of love triangle aspect that MTV forces on all of their television. There was a love triangle going on between Liz's crush Bryson, the most popular girl in school, who I believe her name was Corey or something like that, and Liz herself. And that was really the center point for most of the conflict in the show, and so by season 2, that storyline had gotten super old. It also needs to be said that this show came out during the infamous Twilight Hunger Games era, so of course love triangles were being pushed down everyone's throat, and I also think that played a heavy role into why this show ultimately got canceled. Alright, let's go on to the next. Oh, but before I do that, I do want to say I did find this old interview. It's Liz Lee. Someone caught up with her on their podcast and they interviewed her about being on the show. This is where I found out that the show was actually supposed to be a reality show. I think in the interview she does go over like how MTV manipulated certain situations or created the drama to create a television show. I'll try to remember to link it in the description box below. This next show, I'm not sure that anyone remembers besides me, but I had to talk about this as well. And that's a little known Snoop Dogg produced show, Mary and Jane. Mary and Jane tells the story of Jordan and Paige, who are weed entrepreneurs trying to create a successful weed delivery business in LA while also being young 20-somethings with the typical dating and life problems. Kind of think of The Hills, but with weed. I always thought that one of the funniest selling points of the show is that any article that you would pick up that was promoting the show before it actually premiered, they had called the two main characters ganjapreneurs, which I just think is so funny. And in 2016, in case you don't remember, this is when weed started to be legal all over the place. And so I thought that this show coming out when it did was one of the smartest marketing decisions, because not only was it marketing the sudden legality of weed, but it also set the stage to showcase what it's actually like to be in the weed business, and I thought that that was so interesting. Fast forward to the show coming out, and I would say that the biggest flaw with the show is that it's just not very good. I think that there were some funny moments, definitely some like slapstick humor that helped to really like make the show fun and bouncy. I also think it just lacked any type of depth. But as I mentioned before, the show was produced by Snoop Dogg, so I thought if you're gonna have anyone back your weed show, it better be D.O.G.G. I thought that was an excellent foray into television. But yeah, I thought Mary and Jane was really like, they were onto something. I think if they had had better writing or they had had just more enigmatic casting, that we would have seen this show go on to grow. I thought it was such an interesting idea too, because it was right in the beginning of the boom of weed delivery and just delivery services in general, especially with the rise of shops and just having weed basically available anywhere you go. It would have been interesting to see how this sort of mom and pop business would stay on its feet or stay afloat. But ultimately, this show just does not garner the kind of success that they were hoping for, and it was canceled after the first season. So the last show I want to talk about is actually not an MTV original, but I wanted to include it on this list anyway, just because I don't hear a whole lot of people talking about this show, and I think this show could have really been something huge. The next show I want to talk about is the American version of Skins. Skins was an unsuccessful American version of the UK teen drama hit. This time, instead of the UK, this is based around a group of high school juniors living in Baltimore. Like, if you want all the things that Euphoria has to offer and you don't know what to watch in the meantime while we wait for season 3, go watch Skins. But basically, Skins really pushed the borders of what we would allow on cable television. And Skins in the UK was hugely successful. One of which I might add is our girl from Spinning Out. She actually was on this show once upon a time. Now, because the show was such a huge success and Americans are completely incapable of thinking of our own ideas, we also tried to create our own version of Skins. It was turned down by a lot of networks, or they were asked to water it down so much that it would take away it being part of the Skins family. Ultimately, with MTV picking it up and allowing the creators to ultimately have kind of free reign to make the show that they wanted to make. But unfortunately, I don't think that worked in their favor. Let me just read you a little bit of the drama that was going on when Skins was airing on MTV. Many factors plagued this show. For one, the many parents that were uncomfortable with the subject matter, casual sex, drug use, with even the Parents Television Council filing a letter to the Department of Justice asking them to bring a child pornography charges against the series, which were dropped due to lack of evidence. Several large companies pulled their advertising from the show, and finally the viewership dropped with every episode. The show was canceled after only one season. So this show had already garnered quite a bit of negative feedback prior to the show even premiering on MTV, and ultimately the first episode did really well, as most new TV shows do. I believe that this show premiered after an episode of Jersey Shore, which you have to remember was #1 on MTV at the time that this was coming out. But with every episode, the viewership would decline more and more until ultimately they just opted to drop the show altogether. They did have a lot of big name companies not want to advertise during the show. So if the show can't make MTV money, then the show gets canceled. Ultimately, I checked out this show because I had heard so much about the UK version, but I didn't have any streaming services during this time. So when the MTV American version came out, I was like, okay, well, I'll check this out since it's supposed to be kind of the same thing. And while I did find the storyline vaguely interesting, I just thought that the chemistry between the different characters really didn't work for me. I have had a chance to go and watch the first episode of the UK version. It's been a lot of years, but I have watched the first episode, and I can definitely see why they wanted to create a show like this for America. If this show had premiered 10 years later, we would be having a completely different conversation about it. But I think based on when it came out, we were still too conservative to have a show be this real and raw with teenagers and what they're exposed to and what they're going through. I think that's why shows like Euphoria are working now. But if Euphoria had premiered in 2001, there's no way that show would have remained on the air. In fact, I'm pretty sure there would have been maybe 2 episodes before it got completely pulled. So I think that this show would actually be worth checking out now. I bet that this show probably stands up a little bit better today than it did when it first premiered, but I definitely understand why it just ultimately didn't work out for MTV at the time. So I know I didn't talk about every MTV scripted show. I have quite a few that I actually decided to back burner because those shows were not canceled so quickly, so they actually have a much more interesting kind of history, and I'd like to kind of do those in a separate video where I could delve more into specific TV shows. So I'm going to put a list up on the screen. If there's any of these MTV shows that I didn't get a chance to talk to that you would like to see me talk more in depth about, please let me know. I know that recently I was talking to a coworker about this video idea I had, and she had mentioned to me a little show called The Hard Times of RJ Berger. I don't know if you guys remember that show. I had forgotten about that show entirely. So I definitely think that's something I might go and revisit. I also was a huge fan of Awkward. Awkward actually ran for, I want to say 5 or 6 seasons. So that show might get its own dedicated video just because there's so much to cover in that series. And I thought that that series was just so funny, like funnier than deserves to be on like MTV. But anyway, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed talking about these random MTV scripted shows that ran a portion of my early 20s. As always, if you enjoyed my opinion on all things pop culture, music, movies, TV shows, what have you, do me a solid and drop a like on this video, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. All my socials will be linked in the description below. I try to post behind the scenes stuff over there and polls, and I just try to be as interactive with you guys as I possibly can over there. So make sure that you give me a follow as well as all my other social medias. And until next time, I will check you guys out later. Bye.